Okay, well, it is 6:04, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Lindsay Mosier. I'm in the Office of Community Engagement. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We're excited to speak about this important topic in the city, affordable housing. Today kicks off part 2 of our discussion on outreach for housing. And before we begin, I'd just like to do a few introductions of who from our staff is here today. And we'll start with Nikki. Go ahead and tell us who you are and what part of the city you represent.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being with us tonight. I'm Nikki Olivier Hellenkamp, and I work on housing in the mayor's office, and I'm happy to be with all of you tonight.
Kyle, you want to go next? Thanks.
Sure. I was just waiting for you to prompt me, Lindsay. Hi, everybody. Good evening. My name's Kyle Patterson, also in the mayor's office, and I'm the city data strategist, excuse me. And Eli, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks, Kyle. I'm Eli Griffin. I'm the mayor's office admin coordinator.
Perfect. So as we start today, Eli will be taking notes for all of us. So if you guys have any questions or want any follow-up, just be sure to put those in the chat and we'll try and get to as many as possible. Today will be formatted just a little bit differently. Nikki will give us just an overview of the housing landscape as it is right now, and then we'll have some robust discussion. Any questions that you guys have, put them in the chat, and we'll try and get to as many as possible throughout her presentation. The second half will be Kyle's presentation, which will be focused on the Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative innovation track that focuses on mobile tiny homes and ADUs. And we'll also have an opportunity for question and answers for that. So we're going to try and split it just down the middle. And then again, please put all the questions in the chat and then I'll interrupt and kind of have some nice conversation back and forth. So with that, we will start with Nikki, and Eli will be sharing the presentation.
All right. Thanks so much, Lindsay. So again, my name is Nikki. I'm excited to be with you tonight to talk a little bit about housing in Boise. And Eli, if you wouldn't mind clicking to the next slide, that would be great. So the place we wanted to start is with this idea of a home for everyone. And this is the idea that the city of Boise will create a city for everyone by embracing our community in the decision-making process, innovating and investing to protect our environment, and ensuring a thriving local economy that benefits all. Next slide, please. Okay, so when it comes to how the city is thinking about its priorities around housing, we're looking at 3 ways to do that. One is to produce. So this is investing in the creation of new housing and focusing deeply and aggressively where the market does not. So we're going to get a bit more into this in a few slides, but the city recently did a housing needs analysis that found that in order to meet our housing needs over the next 10 years, we would need to have around between 2,700 and 2,800 units of housing produced each year for the next 10 years. That is a very high number. It is about what has been produced in the last couple of years. So in terms of an overall production goal, we're not that far off from what the housing needs analysis is saying is needed. And I think many of us in Boise can attest to the very high rate of growth and production that has been happening. What we're not seeing, and what this is a nod to in the second part of this produce bullet, to talking about where the market doesn't focus, is that the vast majority of the units that are being produced don't necessarily meet the budgets of most people in Boise. So we'll be talking more about what we mean there in just a minute. The next bucket here is looking at preservation. So when we think about housing that's affordable to people in Boise, the way we've often thought about it is we need to produce more of these units, we need to build more of these units, and we absolutely do. But we also need to think about how we go about preserving units that are already on the market, that are already serving lower income households. The metaphor that often gets used for this is to think about a leaky bucket, that we can spend a lot of energy and time focused on producing more units, pouring more units into the leaky bucket, but if it's full of holes and we're losing all of our existing affordable housing, then it's not going to help us to meet our needs. So that's another piece that we'll really be having a lot of conversations about going forward. And then, of course, we also have a focus on housing our unhoused neighbors, and including units dedicated to our path home, and that's focused on families experiencing homelessness. Next slide, please. Okay, so when we talk about affordable housing, one of the common ways that we describe what we mean is talking about a percentage of the area median income, but this can be a really hard way to have this conversation because most of us, when we talk about the area median income, that doesn't mean a whole lot. So when we, if you look at these numbers for the city of Boise, they assume a 3-person household. That's the average household size in the Boise metro area. We can look at some of these area median income slices and understand sort of what is we're talking about. So when we talk about affordable housing, usually what we mean is that it's housing that's going to be affordable to people who are making 80% or less of the area median income. So if you look at this chart, that means for the city of Boise, that's a household of 3 making just under $54,000 a year or less. So that's generally what we're talking about when we talk about affordable housing. And if you look at the level of need for housing affordable to households in these income brackets, you would see that the housing needs analysis we recently did showed that about 77% of the units needed over the next 10 years that I alluded to earlier, about 77% of them need to be affordable to folks in these income ranges. So that is, if you want to dig into area median income, you can literally Google Boise area median income, and the first link that comes up is the city of Boise's webpage that gives a bunch more examples with different household sizes because it is dependent on household size. So anyone who wants to nerd out on this, feel free. But this is just to give you a sense when we're talking about folks in at 80% AMI or below, we're talking about, again, $54,000 a year about and less for a 3-person household. And when we talk about what it means for housing to be affordable to that household, that means that we would say your housing is affordable if you are paying 30% of your income or less towards your rent. So for that household that's making $54,000 a year in the 3-person household, an affordable rent for them would be around $1,000 a month. So that is when we talk about what is affordable, those are the general metrics that we would use. Next slide, please. Okay, so this graph is beautiful and also kind of a lot to take in. So I'm going to walk you through it. So this is the Boise spectrum of housing needs, and you'll see that each sort of sector of the rainbow there looks at a different area median income group. So you'll see that if we just look at the farthest left slice, this is folks making less than 30% of the area median income, so very low income. They make up 15% of the population in Boise and about 30% of the need for housing. So when we go back to our production goals for the next 10 years, that means that we need about 820 units per year for the next 10 years to serve folks who are in this income range. I can tell you we are nowhere close to that. So this is a really big area of concern. Similarly, if you look at the next slice, the 30 to 60% area median income, you see very similar numbers. So, and then looking at the 61 to 80%, you can see if you look to the bottom of that slice, we're looking at 463 units per year of housing that's affordable to folks in that income range. And then once we get above 80% of the area median income, these are going to be housing units that they're generally served by the market. So looking back at kind of the left half of the rainbow, it looks like a half on the graphic, but it's actually, as I said before, about 77% of our housing need. And the bulk of that really is for those households making 60% of the area median income and below. All right, next slide, please. So what are we doing about it? We have a few efforts in progress. So the Emergency Rental Assistance Program was a direct result of the American Rescue Plan. It's been providing funding, it's been providing rental assistance to over 1,300 households in our community. We have spent in Boise and Ada County, we've spent almost all of that money. So fortunately, a second round of funding will be available this fall. And that money is being granted out through the Boise City Ada County Housing Authority. So that rental assistance has been a really key part of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact that it's had on people's housing stability. The city also funded additional case managers for housing services providers as well. Next slide, please. We're also looking at investments in permanent supportive housing. So this is that 0 to 30% AMI group that I talked about earlier. Oftentimes when we're looking at folks who are in that group, one of the housing options that we want to be able to offer is permanent supportive housing. So this is housing that comes with social supports, which could look like medical services. It could look like case management. A good example of permanent supportive housing that already exists is New Path. And we are looking to build an additional 100 units right next door to New Path. In addition, we're looking at Fire Station 5, which if folks are familiar with it, that is the fire station that's right across from Rhodes Park. It is going to be redeveloped very shortly. And one of the things we're looking to do is to co-locate affordable housing and permanent supportive housing with the fire station there on that land. So that's a really exciting opportunity. Next. Another really exciting thing coming up is the distribution of American Rescue Plan dollars. So Boise was allocated $36 million by the federal government in local recovery funds. And we will be working with residents on how best to distribute those funds. There have already been a few community listening sessions on this topic. There will be more. We are waiting for final Treasury guidance to tell us exactly what we can and can't spend that money on, but it presents a really big opportunity in general, but in particular on the housing front to really make some big investments. We're also doing community stakeholder outreach, as I mentioned, related to how to spend those funds. And we're also meeting with local businesses, medical providers, other members of our community to explore future partnership opportunities. Next slide, please. And we also are having some really exciting progress on the Housing Land Trust. So for folks who aren't familiar with this, the concept is basically that the city will take a piece of land that it owns and will continue to own it, but have what's called a ground lease, where we're basically renting the land to an affordable housing developer. So they then build the housing on the land. One of the terms of the lease is that the rents that are charged there be affordable at a certain level for the length of the lease. So this is one way to get at some long-term affordability, because the lease is, I believe it's a 50-year lease for this first one. And in theory, you know, there's no reason why it wouldn't be renegotiated at the end of 50 years. So the first one of these that we just broke ground on is at Franklin and Orchard. It's going to be called Moda Franklin, and that is going to be, they've begun construction on it. There's also the second site. The RFP has been awarded to an affordable housing developer for a location at State and Arthur. That's, if anyone's familiar with the old Smokey Davis, that is a site that the city acquired and is going to be building affordable housing on it. Oh, and I see a question here. I'll quickly say, no, Moda Franklin will not be affordable at the 30%. It's going to be a mixed income building. So they do have some units in it that will be affordable at 60% AMI and below, some at 80% AMI and below, and some will be market rate. I believe the State and Arthur site is expected to be either 60% or below or 80% or below. And we have, I mentioned Fire Station 5 is going to be done in the similar way with the ground lease. Also, the city owns what's called Capitol Campus. It's a large piece of land across from Boise State University. So looking there, and then also looking at sites like there is a laydown yard near Julia Davis Park, where currently the Parks Department has a place where they store their tools. So questions being asked, around, okay, well, maybe we can store the tools somewhere else and have the possibility of using this land for housing as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think I saw a couple questions coming through in the chat. Please, other folks, if you've been holding back, let us hear your questions. I'm gonna ask Lindsay to read them to me so I don't end up distracted and confused scrolling through. So yeah, go ahead, Lindsay, I'm ready for you.
Yep, one of the questions that came up was how are those developments paid for upfront in reference to the housing trust, land trust?
Sure, great question. So essentially the way it works is that the city puts out an RFP, which is a request for proposals. And we basically say, hey, developers, we have this piece of land. We would like to see affordable housing built on it. How would you do that? And they respond with their proposed projects, including how they would be funded. So most affordable housing, particularly housing that's going to be affordable to folks below 60% AMI, in order to make that low of rent, in order to make the math work essentially for a development to be financially possible, if you're going to be charging rents that are that low, you almost always need some kind of government subsidy, and that can come from a lot of sources. So one of the main sources of government subsidy when it comes to affordable housing is the low-income housing tax credit. That's a federal tax credit that is administered here by the Idaho Housing and Finance Association, and essentially someone who's developing affordable housing would go and apply for that as a funding source. They could also apply for funds from the city. We have what are called home funds, and those are federal pass-through dollars as well, where the federal government basically gives the city of Boise a certain number of home funds each year, and we get to decide how to distribute them to help make affordable developments financially possible. So that's also a potential place that we could look to spend American Rescue Plan dollars, is to make those kinds of affordable developments almost always have what's called gap financing needed, meaning that there's a gap in the amount of funding there that exists and the amount of funding that's needed to build it. So that gap financing that kind of fills the gap is something that we could consider spending American Rescue Plan dollars on if we chose to. And I just saw the question about ADUs. I promise we're going to get to them. Kyle is going to spend so much time on ADUs. You just have to sit through me talking about tax credits, which Eric Kingston, thank you so much for providing the link there for anyone who wants to get some more information on those.
Yeah, I think that was Diane. In case you missed it, Nikki was giving a presentation originally on housing. We'll have a discussion on it, and then Kyle will give a presentation on the ADUs and tiny homes for kind of the second half of this discussion. But we also want to make sure that this conversation goes back and forth. So I have a couple questions that I just want to kickstart a little bit of a conversation as well. Just overall on Nikki's presentation, what are your initial reactions and what kind of resonates with you on some of the initiatives that the city is doing, maybe something that we might be missing, opportunities that we're not seeing. So make sure you guys use the chat option for this as well. And I'll just give you guys a minute to kind of put in a couple words to make this interactive for all of us.
While you're composing your chat text, one thing that I think is important to note in terms of how these projects get funded is that we, as I mentioned, we have federal funds coming. Sometimes the city is able to provide our own city funds for these projects. And I really think that one of the big missing components here is state level funding, that almost every other state in the country has some kind of funding coming from the state to make these kinds of projects possible. And that isn't something that we have here yet. But there is a really big opportunity this year, since the state has its own American Rescue Plan dollars, as well as other funds to allocate, that one thing that the state could choose to do is to put money into the Housing Trust Fund, which was established in the 1990s as a a fund to make affordable housing developments, put money toward them. But it has never been funded. There has never been any money put into it. So this year is a great opportunity for that to happen, and we'll be watching closely and cheering on the legislature and hoping that they make that decision, because having that state source of funds would make a big difference, not just in Boise, but across all of Idaho.
So I had another question come in, which is a really good point of what is planned for the affordable 55 and plus communities. There's a terrible gap in this area in the entire valley.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I just had an email a couple days ago from someone who, she's 85 years old and her rent went up 30% this year, and she doesn't have a way of, increasing her income by 30%. So really looking at the impact for anyone who's on a fixed income, and particularly on older folks. So that absolutely is an area that, very interested in. There already are a couple of affordable 55 and older developments in Boise, but certainly would be very interested in seeing how we can make it possible for there to be more, because it is very badly needed.
We had another question come in from Eric, and he said, I've been impressed with the focus areas in general. These are strategies that have been proven pretty effective in similar communities. Can you address the strategy for the preservation, aka patching the holes in the leaky bucket?
Oh, yeah. So this is one that the city historically hasn't played as much of a role in as on the preservation side. So we're still very much in exploratory mode on this, but there are some really interesting models that have been used other places. In Utah, for example, the state put aside money for preserving affordable housing in across Utah. And this can be something, that is more nuanced than I think sometimes meets the eye. When we think about preserving affordable housing, oftentimes what we're talking about, when I mentioned before that for housing that's affordable to folks at 60% AMI and below, that usually requires some kind of subsidy. Well, what comes with that subsidy is a requirement that the rents be kept at that level, right? If you're going to take city money or federal money to make your building affordable, then you have to promise that you're going and demonstrate that you are going to continue to keep those rents at that affordable level. But when we think about affordable housing that's out in the community, oftentimes we're not talking about subsidized housing where there's an agreement that the rents will be kept at that affordable level. We're just talking about kind of cheap places to live, right? And they may be affordable to a household because that household is because the unit is older, or is in need of repairs, or is in an area that is less trendy, right? And sometimes it's housing that is not particularly healthy or safe. And so we really want to make sure that we're thinking that we're being really thoughtful about what it means to preserve affordable housing. And if what that really means is continuing to keep people, to make it possible for people to live somewhere that is not actually healthy and safe for them and their families. So one of the interesting things that they're doing, that this group in Utah is doing, is looking at market, private market units that are where a landlord is interested in selling, and they've created a preservation fund where a nonprofit affordable housing developer is able to borrow money from that preservation fund and purchase those units and then operate them as affordable housing, as now it's subsidized affordable housing. So there's an agreement that those rents are going to stay low. And then they also have the resources to, make needed repairs, make sure it's, maybe it's still going to be an older building, but at least it's safe and habitable. So really wanting to think to be very thoughtful about how we engage in that space, I think is a high priority. But there's a lot of interesting space for creativity there. So excited to be talking to people about their ideas.
Another one that came through the chat saying, how is the city working with it just scrolled up. How is the city work with neighborhood associations to mutually identify affordable housing options?
That's a great question. So on the Franklin and Orchard project that I mentioned earlier, where the groundbreaking just happened recently, Moda Franklin, there was a lot of work done with that neighborhood association to think through the projects, and to evaluate which ones the neighbors, wanted to see happen. Similarly, at State and Arthur, the project that was chosen was the one that was highest rated by the neighbors. So that's certainly especially on the city-owned parcels, that's going to be a big part of our strategy going forward, is to really engage those neighborhoods in envisioning what they want to see happen in their community.
Okay, this might be a tough one. So see if you have. I know I've been in.
Okay, I'll take a deep breath.
Has there been a comprehensive GIS analysis of underperforming privately owned lands for the potential for rehab or redevelopment?
Ooh, good question. I don't think so. But that is something there's been a little bit of conversation about around here. I know that there has been the city's done that for our land. There's been the state, I know, is looking at doing that on state parcels, but the question about privately owned parcels, I haven't heard of anyone doing it, but if you have it, send it on over because we'd be very interested.
It's all about partnerships. Okay, let me get a second here just to catch up. Oh, Deanna Dupuy has done a report on underutilized parcels. Thank you, Sandy.
Of course
Deanna
she
Dupuy
has.
is one of our comprehensive planners, who that was one of the conversations that we had today about this. This was another one, and this has been a conversation, Kyle, you might chime in here too. Preserving units affordable for lower income people in their homes is important. Rising taxes are forcing people out of their homes. Home share is a great option with the city that the city could help with. Maybe just dip into that just a little bit if you want to, about the whole home sharing and kind of what we've discovered as well.
Yeah, this is Kyle again. Hello, everybody. And I'll talk a little bit more about the innovation program we participated in shortly. But one of the ideas that came out of that we did some testing on was actually home sharing, which I think is a really fascinating idea. I think the idea is that, over the past 50 years or so, what we've seen is household sizes have gone down and home sizes have increased, right? And so what we're left with is a lot of homes where there are empty rooms, right? Where there's bedrooms that could be used for other purposes. So how might we be able to connect people who have empty space in their home to people who need a place to stay? Lots of cool potential opportunities there around, say, a work sharing arrangement where somebody might say, yes, I'll rent out my room for you and I'll decrease the rent by $100 a month if you're going to help with the yard work, something like that. I think it's particularly attractive in community and senior communities where folks may have a home that's a 3-bedroom home because they had 3 kids who have now grown up and gone off to college and now have all this space and they want some more community. How can we partner those folks? And there are a couple of platforms out there, kind of startups doing this work. Silver Nest is one of them. Nesterly is another one, and I don't think they're present yet in Boise, but in some other cities that do that work of connecting people who have space to people who would like to live in a home. So certainly a potential opportunity to pursue in the future.
Thank you, Kyle. I'm just trying to get to some of these are just a little bit repetitive. So another comment from Eric. Oops, this is sliding again. Diane makes a good point. Although the challenge is having a unit of government inserting itself between a willing buyer and willing seller, particularly in Idaho, one argument for this might be to acknowledge the externalized social costs of converting legacy affordable units and find a way to recover the social costs, public subsidy of that loss. It's tricky. One more question I thought I saw up here. How do you plan to avoid urban blight, higher crime rates, and lower property values that inevitably follow lower income housing?
Yeah, so I think one thing I would encourage all of us to think about is who it is that lives in affordable housing, and particularly as the area median income here in Boise continues to go up, as it will, as we have more and more higher earning people come here, that the folks who fall into this 80% and below category are community members who are really important to the fabric of our city. So that includes our, our preschool teachers, the folks who take care of my kids when I'm at work. It includes, the people who serve our food, who make our coffee, who staff our libraries. I mean, I'll say that the city has certainly run into challenges in terms of hiring because of the high cost of housing in our city. And that's something that we hear from a lot of employers, that this is a challenge for so many people in our community. And yeah, I think that that's a really important component not to lose in the conversation. In terms of the question specifically about what we would do if there were increased crime rates, I mean, anywhere in our city, I don't know that we would treat it differently if it was in an area that was affordable housing versus an area that was anywhere else. That, those challenges exist in any city and of course need to be responded to.
So this question comes in from Charlene. This is more about home ownership versus rental. And she said, it sounds like all the proposed units on the land lease program will be for rentals, although very important. Are there any plans for helping families buy homes that are affordable so they can build some equity for their future stability?
Great question. So the short answer is not yet. The focus so far has very much been around rentals, but your point's very well taken, that in terms of building equity and also making sure that affordable home ownership opportunities exist, in general in the future, that's certainly something that's of interest. Affordable home ownership is more expensive than affordable rental in terms of the subsidy that's involved usually. So that's a challenge, but it's certainly not, it's certainly, worth the ongoing conversation, because it is part of that larger housing continuum that we really want to be focusing on as a whole.
There's a couple questions coming in about ADUs, but I'm going to hold off on those still. Kyle, for you in just a minute as you have a chance to give your presentation.
Build the tension.
I know. Everybody stay with us. This one goes kind of back to the home sharing though. Regarding home share, could the city provide some type of grant mechanism to retrofit a home to encourage room rental? Enhancements might include paying for off-street parking or reimbursing the cost of adding an egress door. Just sounds like suggestions and whatnot. If you can speak any more in detail on that, either of you. I know it's just come up in conversations.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting idea, right? So how can we make better use of the space that we have, especially for housing? And I think it's, I'll talk about this in a bit, but through this process, we heard 500 plus ideas from the community with lots of really creative solutions. And I think these two pilots that we're going to be talking about in a minute are kind of the city's first step in trying to get really creative and innovative and work with the community and coming up with ideas and empowering them to happen. And so that might be something that we could pursue in the future. I think it's a cool idea.
Trying to follow all of these comments still coming in back and forth a little bit. Just a few comments, Kyle, that came in about ADU. Sounds like you were on the radio today. Did I miss that?
I guess so.
So maybe let's just see if there's any more comments just in relation directly kind of to housing, what we've been discussing, and then I'll come back to those ADU questions after Kyle kind of gives a minute to present. So just give me a minute here to see if there's any other questions. People are saying, multi-generational families are already kind of home sharing, which is great, up on the bench on larger, older homes. And then just a few comments back and forth on kind of crime and how that follows and whatnot. So I think if we have any other comments, let's see, I have a few more questions here just to follow up. Here's a loaded question. As it relates to affordable housing, and this is for our audience again to kind of chime in, what does a successful approach from the city look like to you? Obviously, we've just presented a couple ideas to you, but we're looking for feedback on anything else you might have seen or heard or ideas that you might have. Again, this is a 2 two-way conversation for us to receive feedback from you guys as well. And we had just a comment here in the meantime from Jerry saying Minneapolis created a large fund which it used to quickly compete with the open market to buy existing developments, which would otherwise be flipped. Is the city considering eventually becoming a bidder like Minneapolis? Maybe Nikki, you can comment on that for a minute.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that we are at the stage where we are considering becoming a bidder like Minneapolis, but I think that this idea of having a fund that whether it's existing folks who would be looking to purchase and would be wanting to maintain those affordable rents would be able to access is definitely something that is of interest. Yes, those kinds of preservation funds. I mentioned the one in Utah. There's also one in Portland, and yeah, the one in I think it's the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund has that preservation fund as well. So yeah, really interesting model on the preservation side.
And just another follow-up to any opportunities that the city might be missing. I know you guys, this is a great idea that was thrown out about Minneapolis and whatnot. So any other comments that come through the chat, we'll just give a few more minutes and then we can just transition to Kyle's presentation as well. Eric, he's our #1 commenter in here. I love it. He said Austin has some good models and no shortage of challenges like those we face in Boise. I recommend connecting with Erica Leak. Thank you for that. Diane said the most affordable housing is in already existing buildings. Home sharing is the fastest, cheapest way to house people once enough homeowners want to do it. Yep, one of those discussions. Exactly. And I think, oh, here comes another one. What about expanding neighborhood works projects? Could those go on some of the land trust places? For those that don't know, the Neighbor Works is a nonprofit that Nikki can probably speak a little bit more to.
Yeah, so NeighborWorks they recently completed or broke ground on their Coal Bluffs project, which is going to be affordable. I believe it's affordable home ownership, to the person's question about that earlier. And so I'm guessing the question is, could we have a nonprofit developer like NeighborWorks develop on city land? And yes, the way that we've been going about selecting which developer and which development gets put on just the couple of projects that we've done so far has been, as I described, through that RFP process, where we basically put the call out to developers in general, including our nonprofit developers, to give us their proposals. And so there certainly is the possibility for NeighborWorks or some other nonprofit developer to respond to that RFP with a proposal. And then we would, go through the same process in terms of determining whether it meets the needs of the community at large and that neighborhood in particular.
And Nikki, just to interject, I believe actually some of the NeighborWorks developments are actually getting city funding through those home funds that we talked about.
Yes.
Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah. So so certainly that is another way that the city supports those types of projects, is by providing direct funding to them. And yeah, my answer was more along the lines of when it's city land.
This question is probably for all of us. I think housing is an all hands on deck initiative. Every city investment needs to be viewed through the lens on how it affects affordable housing. Sounds like that is occurring. Are all of the housing efforts being run out of the mayor's office versus the city department? So I'll speak just now and say all hands on deck. Nikki and Kyle, you guys can go more in depth. We're all in different departments and this is what we're all working on. So.
Yeah, so the execution of all of these projects is going through the Housing and Community Development Department, which is part of our planning department. And my role in the mayor's office is really to coordinate very closely with the folks in HCD. That's the Housing and Community Development Department. And a big part of my role is around asking these kinds of questions of, okay, we've already got a land trust pipeline in place that we know these are the projects we need to execute on. This is what we need to move through. And they also are working on existing initiatives like the housing bonus ordinance, which, it went into effect, I think almost a year ago, and is an opportunity for developers to opt into including affordable units in their developments, and in exchange they get things like an extra floor of development that they can build a taller building essentially. So those kinds of existing initiatives are all through the Housing and Community Development Department, and my role is much more focused on where do we need to be looking next, and how do we look at the Austins and the Minneapolises of the world and bring back good ideas that make sense here, because not every idea will, right? We have a very unique funding environment here that and that means that some things may make sense and some things may not. So I hope that answers that question.
And Nikki, I just add, I totally agree, right? Housing is an all hands on deck approach. And I think the city's, approaching it that way within the city, but also, I think it's very clear it's one of those issues where the city can't solve it alone, right? We need to partner with the community. We need help from residents. We need help from businesses, from nonprofits to solve this problem. And so I think that's part of what really excites me about some of the work that we're doing on Innovation Track, is it's really trying to answer that question, is how can we empower the community to help us in addition to the stuff that we are doing as a city?
I'm so glad you said that, Kyle, because yeah, it absolutely is not something that the city can do alone. And so we're looking at these questions of, okay, how do we do what we can do? How do we convene others? How do we encourage others in our community to be part of the solution? How do we form partnerships with our local business community, with our with other jurisdictions in our area, right? How do we get that kind of all hands on deck, not just within City Hall, but across our whole community, so that we can all be working together, because it absolutely isn't something that the city can solve by itself.
We had another question come in from William regarding the COVID-related rental assistance program. Has the city exhausted the available federal funding? I've heard the state of Idaho may or has returned funds.
Yeah, so my understanding is the same as yours, that the state has may or has returned some of its funds because it hasn't spent them all. The city, it's the city and Ada County together that we are very close to expending all of our funds. I think the last I heard was it was like 85% spent. So by the end of the year, the expectation is that it'll all be gone. But there is that second infusion that will be coming, so that we'll be able to continue on with that rental assistance.
Just another comment from Patricia. I think there are a lot of community partners willing to work on the issue: realtors, BCA, major employers, retired planners like me, AARP, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, like we said before, it takes the entire community to come together to solve some of these bigger issues for sure. Let's see. Mary asked, I'm wondering if any of these new developments will include some units with full ADA accessibility, including wheelchair access.
Oh, great question. I don't know. I don't know whether that's the case with the Franklin and Orchard one that I mentioned earlier, or the State and Arthur. Those are the two where the design has already been, chosen. But I'd be happy to look into that and get back to you. I mean, that piece around accessibility, it's got to be something that we are looking at when it comes to these developments, for sure. Because that's going to be such an important component. Yeah, happy to follow up with you. Maybe is there a way, Lindsay, for Mary to message their contact info? I just want to make sure we can follow up.
Yep, Eli, if you want to take a note, I believe we should have Mary's email from her name that we can send a follow-up. Yeah, so if Eli just makes a note that we can follow up about that. And I do know that in our community engagement office, we do have an accessibility manager that if there's any issues around the city and you want help or assistance, that we do have someone in our office that works on some of these projects specifically to make sure that different areas in the city, different city buildings and whatnot are accessible as much as we can. Another comment, there are multiple organizations working on housing. It is a maze for people to navigate to try and find housing assistance. Is there any movement on bringing people/agencies together in one agency to reduce redundancies and streamline? not asking the city to take over, but put all the experts together versus cutting the pie ever smaller, so many different agencies?
Yeah, so Our Path Home in the last, I want to say they launched it in the late summer, early fall. There is one hotline now for anyone who's calling, who's experiencing housing instability or needs housing support. So there is now a single hotline that the hope is that it will address some of that. Needing to go to 5 different places in order to get your questions answered. And that hotline, that is outside of the city. Our Path Home is our community's continuum of care, and it's made up of, the city is a member. Thank you, Sandy. Sandy's got the hotline number in the chat. The city is a member of Our Path Home, along with many of the other housing and homelessness focused organizations and Ada County. So it's not our hotline. I think that was my point. It's not our hotline, but it does exist, and it is meant to be a place for people to call, a one-stop shop.
And we had a comment from Gary, which we're going to get to this soon. Affordable ADU strategies would be a great way to engage with the existing homeowners to provide a solution.
Hey, good lead in, Gary.
We're going to get there in just a few minutes. Just
Thanks for the smooth segue.
Yeah, Gary's a
know.
plant.
Yes, exactly. Eric gave us another comment: forgivable loan incentive for local homeowners who create an ADU on the condition that rents are affordable based on local wages for a period of time. Eric, you're just killing our entire
Eric's
presentation.
a plant too.
The Coal Bluff project.
Can Eric just give my presentation for me?
Don't apologize, Eric. This is good. We're happy you're here. He's obviously very active in this community, so that's good. Let's see. The Coal Bluff project that Neighbor Works Boise is doing will have almost all units that are visitable. That came from Gary again. I think that kind of wraps up most of the comments that have come in, just general about housing. We have a lot of questions about ADUs, so this might be a good segue. And again, if you think of questions, Nikki's going to stay on as well, so feel free to ask questions if you want to go back to housing. But we will kick it over to Kyle now to kind of give us his presentation, and then we will accept a lot of questions from there as well. So Eli, if you want to start sharing, and Kyle, it's your turn.
Awesome. Good evening, everybody. Again, my name is Kyle. I feel like Nikki's a hard act to follow. She's such a clear speaker, and my natural cadence is like really, really fast. So I'm going to try and take a breath. I'm going to slow down so people can understand me, but really happy to be here. And I just really appreciate when I get to be on a call with community members who are willing to give up their Thursday evening to talk about housing. So thank you so much for being here. And I'm really here tonight because, in addition to all the work Nikki mentioned the city's doing directly right now on this front, the city's also planning to launch 2 pilot programs in the coming months. One related to movable tiny homes, and the other is related to accessory dwelling units. And I'll talk about what those mean in a second. But I'm going to spend about 20 or 25 minutes just providing some details about those pilots and why we're doing them. But really my main goal for tonight is to have a conversation with all of you. So what do you think about these pilots? So while I'm going through the slides, I want everybody to kind of consider a couple of questions. Just keep these in the back of your mind. What excites you or concerns you about these pilots? And then what would success look like for these pilots? So just keep those in mind as we move forward. Over the last year, 10 staff from the city took part in the Bloomberg Harvard Innovation Program. Lindsay gave the full name, but it was too much of a mouthful for me, so I'm going to keep it at that. Focused on housing affordability. And the program's based on the idea that those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. So it's really focused on, engaging residents deeply in every step of the solution finding process. As part of that program, we interviewed dozens of residents, from folks experiencing housing instability and homelessness, to homeowners, to businesses, to nonprofits, et cetera, really just to understand the problem from their perspective. We also held several co-creation sessions in which we invited residents to brainstorm new solutions alongside us. And I mentioned this before, but we got more than 500 ideas from the community on that. And then we worked with residents to test a few of the most promising ideas. And just scrolling through the names on the attendee list, I see a number of folks who played some role in this program and speaking with us as we work through this. So thank you for your work on that. Next slide, please. So I could talk all day about, or all night really, about everything we learned from the research we did through this project, but I just wanted to lift up a few of the most germane insights that really guided the direction we headed in with our pilots. The first one is that we are underutilizing the land that we have, and you can kind of see that image on the left. The data analysis we did shows that there are 59,000 pieces of land in Boise that have a single family home on them, but have more than 3,000 square feet of unused space in their yard. Sorry, that's kind of a mouthful, but essentially they have plenty of space in their yard to put a small housing unit. And so what if 5% or 10% of those folks were willing to put a small housing unit in their backyard? They could receive some rental income, so it would benefit them, but also would really benefit the community and could have a real impact on housing affordability here. The second insight is that small footprint living is in really high demand, and those are things like ADUs, accessory dwelling units, and movable tiny homes. We see this nationally, the demand for these products is going up, and we see it here locally in our permits for accessory dwelling units. There's a lot of interest in that type of living, and that's something that we wanted to see if we could take advantage of through this work. And the last piece is that we heard over and over again that there's lots of homeowners, and I put homeowners on this slide, but really it's lots of folks broadly speaking in the community who see housing affordability as being a major problem. They're really concerned about it and they want to be part of the solution, but they just don't know how to do that. And that just really felt like a missed opportunity. If there's people who want to help, but we're not giving them a way to help, that's a real problem. And so those were some of the things that were in our mind as we were kind of soliciting ideas from the community and thinking about what we wanted to focus on. Next slide, please. So out of those kind of 500 plus ideas we heard from the community, we picked two ideas that we tested more completely. Next slide. And the first is around movable tiny homes. And you've probably seen these on Instagram, on any number of cable shows devoted to tiny home living. They're typically under 400 square feet and they sit on a trailer on wheels. So they're not on a foundation. They could be moved from one site to another. And I think the important thing is these are not currently allowed in Boise unless you're in an RV park. And so the idea is, what if we allowed these movable tiny homes in backyards or other pieces of land in residential areas under the condition that they were used as long-term rentals? So you wouldn't be allowed to use it as, say, an Airbnb or a short-term rental. One of the ways that we tested the idea was to bring a movable tiny home to a local park, Terry Day Park on Federal Way, over the summer. And we just invited residents to come, tour the tiny home, talk to staff, and fill out a survey so we could get some more feedback on their interest in the idea, how much rent they think they would want to charge or they'd be willing to pay to live in one of these. We learned a tremendous amount through that. I think, but what stood out to me about that event was just the outpouring of excitement and support that came from the community around this idea. We didn't really advertise the event, but it was still packed with people. And, I talked to a lot of folks. I know other city staff talked to a lot of folks who are ready to put a tiny home on their land tomorrow, or really excited about the idea of buying a tiny home and renting out somebody's backyard to live in it. So there was a lot of support for that idea. And then next slide, please. The second idea that we tested more completely was around accessory dwelling units, ADUs, and these are also called in-law units or casitas or granny flats, lots of names for them. But they're really just small housing units that residents are currently allowed, so you can do this. You can build one in your backyard, and they are on a foundation, not on wheels, so they're a more traditional housing product. So a homeowner could convert their basement or a garage into a living unit, or you could just build a completely separate detached ADU in your backyard. And so the idea was, what if we gave homeowners a package of incentives and assistance to build an ADU in their backyard under the condition that they rent it out at affordable rates for something like 10 years? And we tested this idea in a few ways, but one of them was just to really have conversation with lots of residents, I think dozens of residents really, about the concept to get their feedback and kind of potential program features. And we found that lots of people are really interested in this. Lots of people say, sure, I would do this in my backyard. Going into our testing, though, I really assumed that what homeowners would really want to participate would be a financial incentive. And we found that while people are glad to take the city's money to do something, in many cases, what they really wanted was an easy button, right? So I don't want to have to find an architect. I don't know how I'm going to find a contractor to build this in this type of market. I'm really intimidated by the permitting process the city has. If you could just make it really easy for me, I might be really interested in this program. So next slide, please. All right, and you can go to the next slide also. So based on all that feedback, the testing we did, all the information received from the community, we decided, yeah, let's move forward with a pilot around each of these ideas. And so for the movable tiny home pilot, what we would do, or what we're planning to do, is to allow movable tiny homes at 5 or 6 sites around the city for a period of 6 months. So we'd be providing temporary approval, a temporary permit to have a movable tiny home for 6 months. We'd be looking for some community members who would be willing to participate in this. And those kind of pilot participants or hosts would receive assistance from the city in getting that temporary approval and making it really easy to get the permits that you would need. Some financial support from a nonprofit partner to cover some of the cost of doing the site work and the fees that it takes to get this done. And so if you put a movable tiny home on a piece of land or a backyard, you'll have to put in like a gravel pad. You'd have to put in some utility hookups so that they can, use sewer and water and electricity and all those things, and that comes at a cost. And we want to make sure those who participate are not losing money by participating in the pilot. And the third thing they would receive is technical assistance and support from a nonprofit, just to try and make it as easy for them as possible. So, how do you manage a property? How do you rent out a tiny home? How do you develop a rental contract? Who do I talk to about doing the site work? How much will that cost? How do I notify the neighbors? Really getting some support from a nonprofit and doing that so we can make it easy. And then the second idea, next slide, please, or the second pilot that we're planning, is to provide 10 to 12 homeowners some incentives and assistance to build that ADU and keep it affordable for 10 years. And what we're talking about for the pilot is that the folks who participate would get, again, assistance from the city in getting those permits. We try to make it really easy. They would get exempted all city impact fees that you currently have to pay if you're building a new housing unit, except sewer connection fees. And the reason is there's a legal reason that requires us to charge it. We can't really exempt it. And then again, technical assistance and support from a nonprofit partner so that those folks get the support they need to be able to do this. So how do you manage a property? How do you do a rental contract? All of that would be part of this as well. But I would say, for both of these pilots, our goal is to try this on a small scale in a lower cost, lower risk environment, but really evaluate them to see if they work, right? So on the tiny home front, is it financially viable to buy a tiny home and put it on your land and do the hookups and still rent it out at an affordable rate? What do neighbors think about having a tiny home in the backyard next to them, right? Do renters really want to live in a 250 square foot home on wheels? Is that really attractive to folks, even if it's affordable? And same thing for the accessory dwelling units, really pairing that with an evaluation to see, is a typical homeowner capable of being a landlord, and are they willing to give up space in their backyard for this, right? So trying to answer those questions. And another one of those questions is really like, what are really the program features that a homeowner might require to be willing to participate in this, right? Is it enough to get impact fees exempted and to get some help to make it easy, or does more need to happen to really be able to scale this? And so based on what we learned from the evaluations, I think for the movable tiny home piece, if the pilot works well and the evaluation results are positive, the city might consider pursuing a permanent code change to allow these. And then for the accessory dwelling units, the idea is if it's successful, if we think it's scalable and there's demand for something like this, the city might provide seed funding to a local nonprofit to try and scale it. And I've missed most of the questions that are coming in, so I'm sure Lindsay will help me, but I saw one, which is what are affordable rates? And I think part of what we'd want to see is at or under 80% of the area median income, which Nikki was talking about. So a family of 3, that's about $54,000. But part of what we're trying to figure out is like what is really possible on this front. Could you build an ADU at a low enough cost that you could rent it out at 60% of AMI, right? Would homeowners be willing to do that? And so we don't have all those answers yet, and that's what we're hoping to find out through the pilot. So that completes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
We have a lot of comments coming in, which is great. And some of those I think you kind of answered throughout. So let me just scroll back up to kind of where they started just a little bit. And some of these, again, I don't think we have answers quite yet for, which is why we're trying to have this discussion. Like I know William had a very specific question about property line setbacks still required for tiny homes. Kyle or Nikki, I'm not sure if you have any answers to that, but I think those are some of the things that we don't have answers to yet, but that's the purpose of this pilot program as well. And to kind of get those like touch points. And someone else mentioned, I think like Maybe there should be a minimum of an acre lot that you have to have an ADU on it. Anyways, just to, be
Yeah, and
for your neighbors too.
I don't have answers to all of those questions, and certainly part of this pilot is about figuring that out. One thing I will say about ADUs, accessory dwelling units, is there already a very clear set of requirements around what's allowed for an ADU, and those include maximum of 700 square feet, at most 2 bedrooms, and they have to be owner occupied, meaning the owner of that land has to live in the ADU or in the primary home that's on that land. So for that one, we would be following whatever kind of planning requirements and city requirements already exist around an ADU. But for the tiny homes, it's much harder, right? Because they're not allowed, right? So we will have to work through and figure out where it's the right situation. I think one of the other things we'll really want to do when trying to find pilot participants is find a place where the neighbors are comfortable with it, right? Because this isn't allowed everywhere. We want to make sure that we're doing it somewhere where the neighbors are okay with it and willing to try this new thing along with us.
An interesting comment from Patricia came through. Instead of assuming property owner would own the tiny home, let them rent the space for the tiny home. Need to think through utility hookups, obviously, on some of those logistics. But yeah.
I think that we heard that a lot from folks, and I think that's potentially an attractive option. I think for a lot of people, they really like the idea that you could still have the dignity of ownership of the tiny home, but have a place to put it. From the survey we did at one of the events I mentioned, what we learned is that it's interesting. Most of the renters who we surveyed said, "Oh, I want to be able to buy a tiny home and rent out space in somebody's land." But the vast majority of homeowners said, "I want to buy a tiny home and rent out the tiny home." And so that's one of the things we'll have to see is there really, how many homeowners would really be able to be willing to just to rent out space in their land, put in the upfront cost of putting in a pad, doing the hookups, and then renting out to somebody in a tiny home.
Another comment.
Sorry, Lindsay, I keep interrupting you. I'm sorry, but one more point that I think is really super interesting too is with both tiny homes and ADUs, there was a fair amount of interest we heard from folks to, hey, I want to build an ADU and move into the ADU and then rent out my home. And I think that's such a fascinating option because by building one small living unit, you could really free up 3 or 4 bedrooms. And that was a particularly attractive option to people who want to really age in place. So, again, this person has a 3-bedroom home that they're living in by themselves because their kids have all grown up. They want some community. Their home may not be accessible. It has stairs. It's hard to get up as you age. Hey, I could build an ADU that is accessible, that's small and easy to take care of. There's, another family living in my old home and we can share the backyard. And so that was attractive to a lot of folks.
Yep. And another comment, which I know this has been brought up, but the city could approve standard building plans that owners could choose from.
Yes. And so I think the goal with the pilot would be to make this as simple and easy as possible so we can move on it as quickly as possible and test it. But that's definitely been part of the conversation. I think there's a lot of interest within the city to do something like this. A number of cities have done this where they will say, go to our website, here's 5 plans that are standard plans. And instead of paying $10,000 for a custom ADU plan, you can license one of these for $1,000. Or some places have even said the city will pay for the plan so that you can get this plan for free. And I think it's one of those many ways the city could work to make building an ADU for anybody just easier and simpler and cheaper.
Yeah. There was another comment about the financing portion of the ADUs, saying it can be a little bit difficult because of the way they are appraised and underwritten. So for many, a financial incentive with a regulatory agreement of some kind would help the homeowner to realize their goodwill.
Yeah, and I think for the pilot, we'd probably be looking for participants who have enough equity in their home that they could do something like a cash out refinance or a home equity line of credit to pay for the ADU. But to scale something like this, I think we'd have to think bigger about what sort of loan products are available. How maybe do we work with local financial institutions for this so that it makes it a possibility for folks who don't have a lot of equity in their home and aren't able to take out that kind of credit.
I don't know if you have this answer or not, Kyle, but what about ACHD impact fees?
Yeah, for the accessory dwelling unit pilot, you would have to pay for those ACHD impact fees. That's kind of outside of our control. And the idea of impact fees is that as you add more residents, you are putting more strain on the system, on our roads, on our sewers, and that we should pay proportionately for that. So we can't deal with that. For the tiny home pilots, we would not charge impact fees for the city. And I've had some preliminary conversations with ACHD, and they're interested in potentially not charging impact fees for the tiny home pilot folks as well, because they would only last for 6 months. So it would be a temporary use.
I'll just chime in here to also say that we are in kind of initial stages of conversations with ACHD about whether they would like to start waiving some impact fees for affordable housing development. So that's still, like I said, in early stages, but yeah, those are certainly a big one.
And one of the barriers to that, I think, is frankly legal, right? There's some legal requirements, I believe maybe in state law, that don't allow the state just to say, oh, we can waive it for you, but not for other people. And so there's some real things we have to think about and work through to make that actually possible.
Yeah, there's quite a few comments in here just about the legalities of it and currently kind of how our zoning is written and the requirements. When I read the restrictions for ADUs, the parking restrictions are daunting. I live in the North End and I can't replace my garage with one because of the parking limitations.
Yeah, I'm curious when the person who asked that question pursued the opportunity, because about a year and a half ago, the city kind of amended their requirements around ADU. So it went from maximum 600 square feet to 7, maximum 1 bedroom to 2. And a piece of that was reducing parking requirements. And I'm sorry to say, and I can track this down, but I don't know all the details of when you kind of get that parking requirement waived. I think it's for like 1 bedrooms in certain situations. So it's possible that you might be able to get those waives under the current ordinance.
Yeah, that was Diane. If you want to send us your information, we can follow up on that as well for you. Okay, catching up here. A lot of people are sending us information. That's great. If you guys are interested in the pilot program, feel free to send us a message directly too. A couple of you have been doing that, which is great. We'll take down your information. I know Kyle's kind of keeping a list of those folks that are interested. Deed restrictions.
Note on that is, from a timeline perspective, we're really in kind of the outreach and planning phase in November and December, kind of starting to think about who might be our nonprofit partner to carry out some of that work. I think it'd be more like January, February when we start actively recruiting participants in this. So please do let us know if you're interested right now, but please also know that it probably won't be until late December or January when I get back to you, but really appreciate to hear if folks are interested.
A comment from Derek: deed restrictions on ADUs are a hindrance to some of my clients. Can you speak to that group? What is it? Why it's there? Could it be less difficult to encourage more ADUs?
Yeah, thanks, Derek. And I think when Derek's talking about the deed restriction, he's talking about the owner occupancy requirement. So to build an ADU, the owner of the land has to live in the ADU or the primary home. And so if you build an ADU, you put a deed restriction on your land, which essentially says, you know, even if you sell this to somebody else, it has to be owner occupied, right? And so the reason why we put that owner occupancy requirement in place is when we went through this process about 1.5 or 2 years ago around relaxing restrictions on ADUs. The one thing that we heard loud and clear, we got the most comments on by far from the community, is they really wanted that owner occupancy requirement. And I can't speak for everybody who made those comments, but I think it was a number of reasons behind that. One is concern about, oh, if you do this, will it provide an incentive for outside investors? It makes it more attractive for them to come buy homes and build an ADU, and now they can make more money off of it. Or is it going to bring in you know, a lot of Airbnbs, and there's going to be parties in my backyard or my next door neighbor's backyard? I think it was concerns like that. So that's where I think the community concern came from, and that's why we kept it in place. It is something that I think we should continue to have a conversation about. One of the ideas that came out of this process around ADUs is, well, could you do some sort of bonus program where we say, we will, instead of, you know, a maximum of 700 square feet, we will let you build 1,200 square feet. We will remove the owner occupancy requirement if in exchange you agree to rent it out at affordable rates for a period of time. That's something that came up and that I've heard some conversation about as well. So it's one of the many things I think we need to continue, just keep talking about how to make this process easier and better as we move forward.
And Addie gave us a comment, kind of currently going through some of the difficulties. I'm currently working with an architect and applying for a building permit for an ADU, and it's been somewhat frustrating process as a builder owner. I feel like I get different answers from planning and zoning each time I talk to them. The process seems designed to support established general contractors, but not builder owners. Would your pilot program allow for builder owners? Yeah,
I think that's something that we're looking at. And first of all, I'm sorry to the person who asked that question. That sounds incredibly frustrating. But yes, I mean, I think the pilot, we will probably be really trying to make it a quick turnaround. So try to build things as quickly as possible. So I don't plan on including the pilot a builder owner because that period can take longer. It takes a little more assistance. But as we're going through this, I think that's something we want to look at. Are there other things we could do to make the process easier for everybody, whether you're building an ADU to be affordable housing or an ADU for, you know, a spare bedroom or something? Like, how do we just make that process easier? Because we heard that over and over, that process can be really intimidating to a typical homeowner who's not doing development on a regular basis and interacting with the city.
Has Boise considered a tiny home community be developed on city-owned land? That could be an option toward affordable housing, especially for 1 to 3 people.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting idea. I mean, for me, the first step is let's try this tiny home thing out and see if it works. Is it actually a viable option as low cost housing? I think that for the pilot, I would love to be able to try tiny homes out of a variety of contexts. So imagine maybe a tiny home in a backyard, maybe 3 or 4 tiny homes on a parcel of land, so more of a tiny home community setup. So I'm hoping that we can evaluate those different types of approaches. But if we go through this process and find that it is a viable option that we might want to pursue a permanent code change, that would certainly be on the table for some of the other approaches that Nikki was talking about with our land trust, with city land, et cetera.
Another question, which I think you can speak to, garage conversions or remodeling to include ADU in existing residences may be cheaper. Any thoughts if they would be included in the pilot?
We aren't, I think it's a great point and right on. I think from the sort of comps and numbers that I've heard from other folks is that like a 700 square foot ADU right now probably costs around $175,000 to build. So these aren't inexpensive, whereas a conversion can be more like $100,000. And so that's a really attractive option. It's potential that we might include a conversion as part of this. But again, the goal of the pilot is to keep it simple. So to the extent that we could do 10 ADUs that all have the same design, that are all being built at the same time, it might be able to save cost for homeowners and bring down the cost of those ADUs so they can rent it at more affordable rates. So for the pilot, we might stick to the detached ADU that we can build 10 of them that are all alike in the same way. But I think that's a really great opportunity to pursue in the future because, as you mentioned, it is a cheaper option, which means you can then charge a lower rent and still keep some positive cash flow.
Just a good comment from Gary. The Fannie and Freddie liberalized the requirements on underwriting of loans that included ADUs, but this apparently has not filtered its way down to appraisers and lenders. You might benefit by trying to work on some educational efforts with lenders and appraisers.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And that's a barrier I've heard from lots of other cities I've talked to who are doing this, or homeowners who have done this, is that, you know, if you have enough equity in your home, you can get maybe a cash out refinance, but you can't just take out a loan on the future value of an ADU in the way that you can in other ways, like a traditional mortgage product for a house. And that's been a barrier in a few ways. I think there is interest moving forward in a lot of banks at like a national level who are thinking about ways to do this. And it would be a cool thing to pursue, to talk some more with some local banks about whether they might be willing to find some innovative approaches to help fund these. And there are a few financial institutions I've heard of throughout the country peppered around who are starting to do this now. And so I think in the next couple of years, it's going to be a much more common product.
A suggestion on this came in from Eric, just saying maybe work with a local credit union to create a specialized loan product. Could the city create some sort of modest credit enhancement or backstop to incentivize lending?
Yeah, it's certainly something we talked about. And, you know, I've heard of some conversations with some local banks where there could potentially be interest there. I think the interesting thing for banks is they have this Community Reinvestment Act requirement to lend to certain communities to use innovative approaches in their lending around housing affordability. And so maybe there might be some good partnership there. Yeah, great point.
Just a couple comments on reoccurring of like making sure that the owner occupancy to keep the spirit of the ADUs, the owners on site, as well as the major concerns about Airbnb.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Catching up here. Go ahead, Kyle.
Part of the argument, right? And I won't pretend like I have the answer to this, but part of the argument is by allowing ADUs to be built in non-owner occupied parcels of land, could it potentially actually be increasing housing costs because you're adding value to that land? Are people coming in to compete with other residents, you know, who are investors to buy those parcels? I won't pretend like I have an answer to that, but it's a really interesting question.
Just a few more comments here that were happening in the chat, but I think one of the questions that we wanted to ask too is, how would you feel about either one of these pilot programs in your neighborhood? Could you see ADUs? Are there currently ADUs in your neighborhood? Would you be okay? Do you have the space for one? Would you be interested? And tiny homes too. I think, of course, there's all these HGTV shows and whatnot, but there is a cool community around tiny homes. And I think it's an affordable option that is a great consideration. I think we're taking. Some of the concerns I saw in the comments was just like, is this a short-term solution? And I think, some of the discussions that we've been having is, you go from someone that has an apartment and then maybe to a homeowner. That's a big jump to make from being an apartment renter to a first-time homeowner. Is there somewhere in between that then can bridge the gap to then move to the next step, as a homeowner? And maybe a tiny home fills that gap.
Yeah.
A comment, the goal of the lenders will be to do conforming loans. If they sell on the secondary market rather than warehousing, then that's the advantage of the Fannie and Freddie changes in underwriting rules. Obviously, a couple of challenges there, but Charlene says, happening all around me with ADUs. I think, did you say, Charlene, that you lived in the North End? Maybe don't have any problem with it in my neighborhood. That's great to hear. And maybe just because we do have ADUs, maybe if people can comment about the tiny home, if it's a tiny home neighborhood or a location that's kind of built around that specific community, how would you feel? Do you think there's certain pockets in our community that you could envision that happening? Bench, I live on the Bench, and there's definitely different pockets of town that I could easily see some of that. Some CCNRs don't allow for ADUs. Yep, that's.
We've definitely encountered that from some folks we talked to, that, as part of your covenants and restrictions, right, that you sign when you come in, that doesn't allow a separate dwelling. And so I think that'll be one of the ways that we try and find pilot participants and vet them, is to make sure that they don't have those.
Another comment, there are ADUs in my neighborhood, and I would support ADUs in tiny homes, although I don't have space for one. I live in a small home, roughly 500 square feet. I think another question.
You're just 100 square feet away from a tiny home yourself.
Another question, and not sure quite of the audience if we have mostly homeowners or renters, which is also an interesting thing to hear. If you were a renter and saying, would you consider these options? Maybe you're fresh out of college, maybe you're just a single person that doesn't use much space, maybe it's just affordable options. I mean, there's 1,000 different reasons that you might consider these, but thinking in our wide variety of audience, would you consider some of these options? I think there are a few more comments I can scroll up to. Sounds like Eric said they brought in a project manager to Boise in 2015 to discuss their approach in Eugene, and he provided a link that might be interesting to look at. There are many large surface parking lots that could be transformed into a tiny home community. Someone sent us saying they did receive a couple different quotes to receive an ADU. Lowest quote, $200,000. That's definitely one of the challenges that we're facing right now, especially in the current market that we're in with building and whatnot too. But again, trying to think long-term as well, that we're not always going to be in this current state of market.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that we heard a lot of ideas about, and I think really important, is how do we get innovative in like construction techniques and how we build these and how we do them to bring down costs, right? It's not like I'm paying for this custom design and I'm paying for this contractor to come in and build this custom design they've never used before. How do we make it more like an assembly line, right? Using factory built ADUs that are all the same, buying in bulk. How are ways that we can bring that cost down so it's not $200,000? Because at $200,000, it becomes really hard to pay for the ADU and still be able to rent it out at a rate that most people can afford.
I'm not sure if you have this answer again, Kyle. How is that kind of deed restriction monitored?
I'm not going to pretend to know that. I don't know.
I was like,
Nikki, do you know?
I wasn't sure. No.
What was the name of the person? We can try and get back to
That
them
was
on
Gary. Eli, will you take a note of Gary? We'll try and get that answer for you. Patricia left a comment saying city can review new developments to see if those restrictions are included. Developer may voluntarily drop the restriction if they think it will help gain approval. They typically aren't known until final platting. Patricia is our previous planner. Does the city see any legalities with the tiny house on the trailer platform from the state's perspective, specifically tiny houses on wheels?
Yeah, I don't think so. So the state defines tiny homes and RVs in the same way. So, and just a reminder, like both of these are on wheels, right? They're on trailers, but RVs are typically made to be, you know, temporary living units. They're made of like fiberglass. They have a flat roof, right? All of those things. Whereas tiny homes, by contrast, also on a trailer, but they're typically made of traditional housing material. So they're framed like a house often, right? They have siding on the side. They have a sloped roof. So not always, but many of them can be much more durable than an RV, but the state treats all of them the same and requires the same sort of building requirements around both of them. So, but they don't say anything about where they are allowed, right? So any tiny home would have to adhere to the state's building requirements, which are pretty minor. It's basically the same that you would get for an RV. But the state, as I understand it, leaves it to cities to say, where are those RVs or tiny homes allowed to be placed? And so it would be up to the city to say, yes, we will allow tiny homes on wheels in residential areas.
Here's a good question, kind of a technical question. I'm not sure if we have the answer for this quite yet either. Will THOW going in require a CUP or zoning certificate, et cetera, or just drag it in and it's good to go?
It would require, so what we're talking about is our Planning and Development Services Department that does kind of permitting has the authority to provide temporary approval for a different use. I can't tell you what that's called in the code specifically. So they can say, hey, if there's a compelling reason for this use that's not typically allowed, we'll provide temporary approval for 6 months to do that. And so that's what we're talking about using here. So it would be an administrative process, as I understand it, which means it's not like going in front of city and council or planning and zoning commission. It would be a city decision to do this. Of course, it would be really important that we would only grant that approval if there's a willing homeowner who's going to do this, and also the neighbors are okay with it. We'd want this to be a very collaborative effort. But if that goes well and we decide to pursue a permanent code change, then we'd have to work through what exactly that would look like and what it would require. Would that just be a permit like we provide for ADUs, or would that be something different?
Here's another good question. I live on a large corner lot and could accommodate 2 tiny homes with each of their own off-street parking. Could two tiny houses be allowed on one lot?
Yeah, theoretically. I mean, that's the case in some places. There's a number of cities across the country that have allowed movable tiny homes and movable tiny home communities with different sort of levels of requirements. And so I'd certainly love to pilot a situation in which we could have a parcel of land where we have multiple tiny homes, 2 or 3 of them, to try that community outreach approach. I'm hearing a lot of support for the idea, which is awesome, but I also see a couple of comments. This is a terrible zoning strategy. I'd love to hear more from folks who think this is a bad idea and what they're concerned about, because I think that's really important for us too, as we go through this, is like, well, what do we want to evaluate, right? What would success look like? And I can't guarantee that these ideas will work. So making sure we're asking the right evaluation questions, so when we come out the other side, we can really answer the question about whether it's a terrible idea or it's a good idea.
Yeah, Patricia left another comment saying it should be treated as an accessory use to primary use. May need to revise definition of accessory use. Needs to be clearly allowed in the zoning ordinance and not as an exception.
Yep, good point.
And again, I'll just reiterate what Kyle said. You know, some of the negatives are things that might be more apprehensive to accept one of these in your neighborhood or in your backyard as well. And I'll just try to scan up here just a few more comments I think that I might have missed. Eric left a comment saying you could use compliance monitoring process similar to annual recertification of Section 8 landlord tenant status. Does the city/Ada County already, or Boise City/Ada County already does this for housing choice voucher program participants?
Yeah, and we're still in conversation about, like, for say like the ADU pilot, where we're saying affordable rates for a period of 10 years, how we would monitor that, what we would require. some kind of affordable housing requires annual recertification, which means like every year you have to provide income information as a renter, right, to show that you still qualify. There's another approach, which is just that, and the potential concern with that is, what if somebody's right near the barrier and 5 years in or 2 years in, their income goes up a little bit and they're just slightly above 80%, and now do they have to move? Another approach is, that you just require certification at the very beginning, right? Making sure that you're renting somebody who's at that income level at the time that they're renting. But if they income out, if their income increases, maybe they stay. And so that's another thing that we're thinking through as well.
There was one more I just saw. Oh, Patricia made a comment, saw a program in Santa Cruz, California that gave home funds to Habitat for Humanity, and they gave $100,000 in construction costs to the homeowner. And then another comment from Patricia just saying it should be treated as an accessory use to primary use. May need to revise. Oh, I read that already. I've had too many calls from financial institutions, insurers, et cetera, in my career that want to know if the structure met zoning. Exceptions are perceived as being vulnerable.
Yeah, sort of the weight that they're provided in zoning code can make a big difference in other pieces. Yeah, that's a great point.
Yep. Eric put another comment. I recommend reaching out to Andrew at Square One Villages. He's a planner by training and works closely with the city of Eugene to develop their current ordinances for both detached bedrooms. Opportunity Village and Emerald Village, tiny homes on foundations. So we will make comments. All these comments it'll save for all of us, by the way. So we'll have all these notes that we can take back as our recap. In the previous discussion, talking about the city land to be developed someday, how about THOW temperature temp community while the proposal, call, entitlements, et cetera, go through the future development?
Yeah, so I mean, the pilot that we're talking about, these would be all temporary by nature, right? Because we're providing temporary approval for these pieces. But we're talking about, if this works, maybe pursuing a permanent code change where it wouldn't be a temporary use. I think the person asking the question is talking about the city has a piece of land, we're going to develop on it in the next year. Would we put tiny homes on it in the interim? I'll probably defer that question to Nikki. But one thing I will say is, one of the things that we found is, as we're planning through this and thinking through that 6-month horizon for somebody to live in a tiny home, is that there's some real, legitimate concerns about the 6-month period, the temporary period, being really destabilizing for people, right? So if you have unstable housing and now you have a place to live for 6 months, and after six months you have to go somewhere else, that could create its own problems.
The only thing I'd note there, in addition to what you said, Kyle, is just that the way the tiny homes that are being contemplated in the pilot would have sewer hookups, would have utility hookups. And so the question of whether we would spend the money to do sewer and utility hookups on a piece of land that we know is going to be developed in the near future, I think would be something to consider there.
There was a comment from Victoria, sorry, this was in the question portion, not the chat. It said, is the city prepared to guarantee that those lots that build ADUs will not find the city stepping in later and splitting that lot, creating 2 taxable lots, thus raising property taxes to the point that the ADU now has costs exceed any savings? This has happened in Portland.
I haven't heard about this, and certainly there's no intentions that I'm aware of the city to do something like that. I mean, I think even whether it's 1 parcel or 2 parcels, you're going to pay taxes on the value of the built structures on that property. So I'm sorry if I'm misunderstanding the question, but that's not something that I've heard of there being any intention of doing.
Charlene just left a comment. I appreciate the thoughtful approach the city of Boise is taking in exploration, solving some of the housing crisis that so many people are facing. Jason said, what about tiny homes on wheels that aren't built by RVIA certified dealers? Will you have a way to allow self-built tiny home on wheels to be inspected and allowed? The state specifically defines RVs as temporary. Do you see this as a problem for tiny homes classified as RV if they're being lived in long term?
Yeah, my understanding is again, that the city can decide where we allow tiny homes and what kind of uses we allow for them. It's really the state kind of controls the building requirements for them, kind of minimum building requirements for them. So it's my understanding, based on our conversations internally, that there's not a legal issue there, but that's something we're going to continue to explore as we move forward. And the other question was about tiny homes on wheels that aren't built by RVIA certified dealers. So for folks, RVIA is a kind of a building certification for RV. So it has to meet a certain standard to be an RV, which is much less than the building standard for like a permanent home. One of the other things that we've talked with folks about is there are some national certification programs that have kind of building requirements that are more strict than RVIA, right? And so one potential approach could be, if the city moved forward, would be to say that if you have a tiny home in your backyard, it must meet this more strict national certification requirement around building. And so, but then anybody, whether they built it themselves or bought a tiny home, as long as they're adhering to those building requirements, could do that.
One of the challenges I have experienced assisting with ADU development is high cost of bringing up to code an existing building space. Can cost be prohibitive in regard to upgrading electrical and having to put in a sprinkler system?
Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly the case that, you know, I think the sort of ADU piece is not for everybody, right? Some people live on a hill, some people have limited space in their backyard. There might be other upgrades that need to happen where it's just not financially viable for them to be able to do it, which is unfortunate.
Here's another comment. Patricia suggests putting tiny homes on wheels in parking lot, which would surely be temporary. Why not find land for a new trailer park or stop eliminating trailer parks, as will likely happen in the State Street Urban Renewal Zone?
Yeah, I think that's something that for the pilot participants, if there's the right piece of land, that's say a parking lot, that could potentially be a good candidate depending on how it's zoned and the neighbors and that piece.
Here's another good comment. Oops, just scrolled up. I continue to worry about property taxes increasing caused by building an ADU. I don't want to use the ADU to be a profit opportunity. I'm willing to break even, but don't want to lose money when trying to provide affordable housing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that's one of the things that we'll be trying to figure out through this pilot is what is really the all-in cost of building an ADU, right? There's the cost of building the ADU, there's the impact fees we talked about, there's the property tax increase that would result in that, there's the maintenance on the ADU, right? Like what is really that all-in cost so we can get a better sense of what somebody could reasonably charge. I will say that, you know, the property tax piece is something that's kind of largely controlled by the state. So we have limited control over that piece for a specific piece of land like an ADU.
Eric gave us another option, saying another financing option involves regulation crowdfunding, where local non-accredited investors could assume the position of the lender. This is a debt financing with a fixed rate of return over a fixed time frame. One example of an online portal for regulation crowdfunding, and he gave us a website. The individual building an ADU would list their project on this or another portal, repay the loan over time like any other mortgage.
Yeah, I love that idea, and I think it really fits in with this kind of approach that we're talking about of the city can't solve this problem on its own. We need help from the community, right? And how do we provide clear ways to empower the community to help? I would love if at some point, you know, the city had some sort of website app about, you know, how you can pitch in with housing, right? Build an ADU. If it works, put a tiny home in your backyard. Here's a crowdsourcing website that you can use to fund the types of developments that you really want in your community. So we can make it really easy for folks to be able to do that. And I've seen that in other communities, the small change website that Eric mentioned, I've seen that elsewhere. And sometimes they're used to fund ADUs. There's a startup out of Portland, I think, called Dweller or something like that. And their model is, it's not necessarily affordable, but their model is, if you want an ADU, just let us know. We will lease out space in your backyard. We'll build it, we'll property manage it and do all of that. And they found that they have a lot of demand for that work. Their big shortcoming is the capital, right? Like, how do you pay for all of that up front? And one of the ways they're trying to do that Dweller is through sites like this, where they're getting crowdsourcing to do that work.
Yeah, Eric followed up with another comment. For those who want to increase our housing inventory regulation, crowdfunding is an opportunity to invest in your own neighborhood and get housing stability. Shared housing would be another citizen-involved solution from Gary. Kyle, that sounds like pods for people. I'm not quite sure what pods means.
Oh, like the moving? like moving pods.
Like moving pods.
You're sure that's what you're talking about?
Maybe. Maybe.
No, these are like, you could look at Dweller's website. They're nice ADUs. I mean, they come with like 3 or 4 standard designs, but they look really nice. They're not like, you know, it costs you $7,000 to build this out of scrap plywood and 2x4s, right? These are like actual homes that are just smaller.
Yeah.
Oh, the business model. Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Right. I missed a beat on that
That makes
one.
more sense.
Sorry. Lost in translation in the chat. Okay, a lot of comments just appreciating all the efforts that we're trying to put forward. So thank you for that. Garden City just started discussions through design review, planning and zoning, and city council for zoning changes specifically on tiny home on wheels. Some of you intelligent commentators and panelists might want to join that discussion too. And I think conversations have been included with Garden City. Maybe Nikki or Kyle can speak on that, but I know some of those conversations have started maybe.
Yeah, they've been kind enough to share the kind of ordinance language that they have so far, which is publicly available. I don't think, and so I'm just taking a look at that just because I'm curious, and definitely is one of those, you know, we're, you know, actively collecting kind of ordinances from other cities that allow us to see kind of how they structure it and how that works, but also still, you know, farther away for us from a timeline perspective. We're talking about doing this pilot starting in early 2022. If it works, then we'd pursue a permanent code change more like late 2022. So we're still a ways off on that.
Yep. And Patricia, I think you have mentioned the city of Greenleaf adopted a tiny home ordinance last year. And then let's go back to a couple questions that we have as well. Are there any additional incentives? A lot of you guys have provided, you know, some of the questions that you might have or barriers, but maybe any other incentives that the city can assist with that might incentivize you or motivate you to participate in each of the programs that we've kind of talked about. And then in the meantime, Eric's providing a lot of great resources for us through here. The Guerrilla Development in Portland uses a combination of conventional financing and crowd investment to create really wonderful housing targeting underhoused people.
Eric is an encyclopedia of housing resources. He's my new Wikipedia. I text Eric anytime I have a housing question.
It's a win. It's a community effort. I'm just scrolling back up to see if I missed any more. Self-build tiny homes can be scary. Yes. William attended our first outreach at Chris Armstrong. Thank you for being involved. We appreciate you. Derek had made a comment. Diane had made a comment saying, I know that my sister lives in West Boise and there are many homes that are rentals and the neighborhood has a very transient vibe to it. It's not good. 2 rental properties on the lot just seems a little double trouble. Why not just have apartments? But yes, we all struggle with some of those questions. What about approaching employers for investing?
Nikki, do you have a response to that?
I just have clarification questions. Yeah, do you mean investing in affordable housing in general or specific to the ADU tiny home conversation?
And maybe just to echo, Eric brought up the St. Luke's is partnering with Arch and Wood River Value to create housing units. Maybe speak a little bit on that, and then maybe Kaylee, I don't know how you pronounce it, sorry, can answer your question to get a little bit more specific there. So they said investing in both. They're employing people who need housing.
Yeah, so I think this is definitely something we're interested in having conversations with employers large and small about. And I think there are a lot of ways that employers can be part of the conversation. And they're certainly one of the groups we've been hearing from more and more in terms of they're seeing the impact on their ability to hire because of this really tough market. So I think there's a spectrum of ways that employers can be involved, and employers that are like St. Luke's that are, you know, a large employer that are really, you know, a local employer, then that conversation around them partnering to develop affordable units is definitely a really interesting one. A lot of our local businesses may or may not have those kinds of resources that would be needed for them to produce housing for their employees. And there are also, you know, things to be thinking through in terms of if it's the employer themselves providing the housing. Now, you know, you're talking about a situation where your employer is also your landlord, and that can create some interesting dynamics in terms of, you know, if I lose my job, am I also being evicted at the same time? But I think that a more common way for an employer to be part of producing housing for their employees is along the lines of what St. Luke's is looking to do and what other employers have looked to do, which is partnering with a developer or another organization to support a project that then maybe the units are affirmatively marketed to the employees of that organization, or, you know, there are different ways to go about it that would try to have it, you know, directly benefit that employer. Another option that I think would be great to have in our community is for our employers and, you know, our local business community in general to contribute to some kind of, you know, impact investing fund, similar to the, you know, crowdsourced ones that Eric was sharing, but on a larger scale, and really thinking through what that could look like. And I think we also see employers as having a real role to play in terms of advocacy for more funding for affordable housing in general, that they have a unique perspective and are sort of unexpected messengers, I think, in some cases, when it comes to advocating for affordable homes. So yeah, and absolutely. I mean, employer as landlord, that's something normal in agriculture. It's been around in our country, you know, since Levittown, and, you know, factory towns are nothing new. They're certainly part of our history. I think it's just worth thinking through all of those components when it comes to what is the way that we hope that the businesses in our community will engage on this issue. But we so very much want them to engage in whatever way makes sense for them, right? And for our community, and you know, for the folks that they employ, but for everyone in our community who needs an affordable place to live. I think there's an important sort of nexus to make between, you know, even an employer whose salary maybe means that they're not worried about finding an affordable place to live. They, by being here, are generating needs in a service-based economy for other people. So that person who's making a high salary also, you know, needs to live in a place where they can find childcare, where they can go to the grocery store and the shelves are stocked, where they can, you know, rely on everyone else in that community to also be able to be there and be able to be, again, part of that larger fabric. So yeah, that was a really long answer to yes, we're very interested in the in the conversation around how employers can be part of can be investors or can be part of the conversation more broadly.
And if anybody in the meeting is a major employer, just let us know. We're
just
happy
lurking there.
Speak up.
We want to talk to you.
Kelly did bring up a good point about a lot of the large employers have foundations as well who need to donate money. They can expand what they fund to help with housing. A question from Karen: how many state employees qualify for rental assistance funds with ARP? State should reimburse city any funds used to help with state employees.
Ooh, that's interesting. I like it. I don't know the answer, but interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of the same arguments have been made for employers who have workers, like the vast majority of their workers are making very low wages, right? So people make the argument that like Walmart should reimburse local governments for the costs that it takes to essentially make up the difference in their wages and what it actually takes to live somewhere.
Another question. This one was from Jerry. Could the city act on land outside city limits, a new tiny home on wheels community in the county?
I don't know. An interesting question. And I might, to be honest, I don't think in Ada County, movable tiny homes are allowed either right now. So we're even talking about going way, way, way out in the country. Frankly, it's not something we've considered. I'm not sure what the legal ramifications of that are.
Just a few other comments. Oh, Patricia just said, I think it would help with employee retention. I wonder if there are any current examples. That's a great, I'm not sure if anybody has any current examples of seeing that work. I know personally a faculty member qualified for and bought a NeighborWorks house. And of course, comments. This is a housing discussion. If only it could be about wages in the state as well. Okay, I think that's just for essence of time. Kyle, I want to make sure I want to get all the questions that you wanted answered, asked. Also leaving kind of the last question of maybe what defining success looks like for this pilot program. Just trying to get the last kind of feedback from our group that's here tonight before we send them off. So again, just kind of looking, what would success look like for this pilot program? How should we measure it? Any other groups we're not considering that should be involved? Just reading some of these comments. The city would have to get a CUP from the county, but most of that area is in the wildland fire interface zone and wouldn't allow concentrations of people in that hazardous area. We need to rethink the concept of subsidy. Displaced workers provide a subsidy to employers and customers by commuting long distances, compromising health and safety in order to provide service at a price we consider affordable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think it's not new. It's just happening to more people. And so it's starting to be part of a larger conversation, is the fact that so many people are, it's the old real estate saying of you drive until you qualify. So people who have a job in Boise are driving farther and farther out to find somewhere where they can qualify. And so that means you have childcare providers who work in Boise and live in CUNA, and that person is subsidizing everyone's here in order to get the service that that person provides. That person is subsidizing it with their long commute and the additional cost that means for them, and the harm that it does in terms of, you're commuting 45 minutes each way. That's time you can't be part of your community. You can't be with your family. You can't lead your kids' Girl Scout troop. Like there's so much cost to that individual beyond the monetary cost. I think that's a really important point.
Callie brought up a good point. I know Indy Dwell has changed, but a new house near Boise State is shipping container duplex. Is there conversation about expanding this type of housing?
Nikki?
I would say define conversation. I think, yeah, I mean, there has been interest in the affordable housing world on, modular construction, on finding other ways, cheaper ways to build affordable units, shipping containers, and the Indy Dwell, what Indy Dwell does is definitely, one way to look at that. So yeah, it's part of the conversation in terms of the city actively seeking out shipping container companies to do this with, or other kinds of modular housing. It's not something that we're, actively pursuing, but it's definitely part of that larger conversation.
Patricia left another comment. The pilot program needs to build different prototypes and measure demand, and then provide catalog of options for property owners. Maybe create an online portal where property characteristics could define what options are available to a property owner.
Yeah, the city of Seattle has a really cool site. I think it's called 80 Universe. Very clever name. And there's some really cool functionality that we've looked at and considered, like, oh, might we do something like this here, where it kind of does that. It lets you like put in your address, and it lets you know, like, are you allowed to build an ADU there? Might you have enough space? They also have those kind of pre-approved standard plans, right? So you can see on that same website what those standard plans are and what they look like and how big they are, to think a little bit about like that. So I think it's a good idea and something that we're definitely considering moving forward.
Just another comment on measuring success from Derek said, success with the tiny homes on wheels pilot would be no upset neighbors. If the neighbors are okay, then everyone is okay. I think that's just kind of what we're looking for, of, are people okay with it in their neighborhood, in your backyard?
I think it's a great point. And, you know, from our conversations with residents around ADUs, which are currently allowed, you know, generally residents that we've talked to who are neighbors are totally fine with them. Their two concerns are, do I get to maintain my privacy, right? So if this is a ADU on top of a garage and it's overlooking my yard now, am I concerned about that? And the second piece is, will you use it for a short-term rental like Airbnb, because they're concerned that like there will be parties there, there's kind of the people coming and going, etc. But outside of those two concerns from the people we've talked to, there aren't a lot of concerns. So it'll be interesting to see if that translates to movable tiny homes. Is that sentiment the same, or is it something different because it's on a trailer?
Another comment from Eric, we are all seniors in training if we're lucky. We need to create housing that is visitable and usable as we age in place. Thinking of all different members of our community, obviously, and everybody's different needs. Again, if you have any final comments, we do have 2 more upcoming events that will be in person. These are both on our website. One will be at the library at Hillcrest, and then the last one will be at Boise State as well. Those are in December, so you can check out our website for those. You do have to pre-register, as we are capping the limits on those. Kyle, Nikki, Eli, any final thoughts for our group before we send off, or final questions?
Just, wow, this was an active conversation. I love how engaged everybody is. And again, like the fact that you all are giving up your Thursday night to have this conversation just really is inspiring. And I'm really grateful for your time.
Likewise.
Yeah.
Really, really appreciate everyone's thoughtful comments. It was a real pleasure to be with you.
Agreed. Thanks.
And Eric, I'm going to text you with all of my housing questions now.
Our future conversations will be similar to this, that we have the discussion on housing and the tiny home and ADU. We just felt like they were 2 in 1, the same kind of conversations, and we didn't want to have separate outreach. So the next 2 events will be formatted similar to this as well. So if you guys all have questions, we have a couple follow-ups I know that we need to do. Our information should be available, and we can provide it, or you can message us. That'll go to us as well, and we can provide more information. And am I missing anything else? Don't think so. Everybody's shaking their head no. Okay, thank you all, everybody. Have a good evening and be well.